Okay, thanks all for staying with us for the last session of the day. The Gulf Horn Ties, the road ahead, looking to delve more deeply into some of the issues raised throughout the day, from the morning keynote to the first panel discussion and Dr. Anwar Gargash's comments just now. With us to do this, moderating the session, is our colleague, senior resident scholar at AGSIW, Hussein Ibish, joined by Ambassador Tom Kelly, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Djibouti and currently the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Raytheon International. Also with him is Murithi Mutiga, who's the Project Director for Horn of Africa at the International Crisis Group. And last but not least, Dr. Abdullah Al-Saud, Director of Research and Head of Security Studies at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, a good friend of ours, and the center is full of interesting and wonderful research on the region. So we're always glad to partner with them and make use of the great resources that they have. Great. Hussein, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much for sticking with us, and thanks to all of you for hanging in there. This has been a very interesting conference, and I think it's just going to get even more interesting now because we have this exceptionally high-powered panel with us. I'd like to begin with a kind of an overview of the strategic relationship between the region. And really the first question that I'd like to look at is, what exactly do you think, and all of you, maybe beginning with Dr. Al-Saud, what do you think has drawn the more internationally engaged of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, into a much deeper role, much deeper engagement with countries in the Horn of Africa? There are some obvious points that I won't belabor, but I'd love to know what you think exactly, what's in it for the Gulf countries, so to speak. And we'll begin with you, sir.
Thank you very much. First, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here sharing the stage with distinguished experts. As His Excellency just now, Dr. Anwar Gargash said, I think the relationship between the Arabian Peninsula and Africa, the Horn of Africa especially, dates way back. But if we specifically talk about the last 4 to 5 years, and I'll talk about the reasons why Saudi Arabia specifically views this region as of geostrategic importance. Well, there is the obvious reasons that we share a religion. Many of the countries in the region speak the same language, Arabic. But there is also 2,400 kilometers that Saudi Arabia has on the Red Sea, which accounts for about 40% of the total coastline on the Red Sea. Also, lots has been mentioned about the change in the international system, how it's in flux, the US retrenchment from the region. And in light of all of these changes, whether that's, of course, actual or perceived, that's a different story. I think, in terms of numbers, US personnel or US military has increased in numbers in the last couple of months. Yep. But there is, perception sometimes drives reality on the ground. And that's very important to keep in mind. So in light of these changes in the strategic environment in which many countries, especially the GCC countries, find themselves operating in, they had to have a proactive role in order to safeguard their own interests and also the collective interests of the countries in the region, especially maritime security, because as we said and established many times, this waterway, the strategic waterway through the Bab al-Mandab and the Red Sea handles about 15% of international trade on a daily basis. Unfortunately, the area and the region suffers no shortage of weak and fragile states. These states that lack good governance do not only result in internal political instabilities, but most threateningly for the whole region, they provide an attraction point and safe haven for terrorist groups, armed non-state actors. We've seen this with, the previous sessions talked about Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. We cannot ignore the fact that ISIS also, as they are defeated in Syria and Iraq, they might find safe haven in other countries, in Sahel or in the Horn of Africa. There is the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, and that also factors in the strategic calculations of the GCC countries. Their coup against the Yemeni government proved the worst scenario, that how malign and negative interference and support to armed non-state actors can actually prove detrimental to peace and security in the region. There is also the issue of food security. Following the 2008 crisis, food prices spiked. And as a result, many GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, rushed to buy farmland, especially in Sudan and Ethiopia, as a hedge against food insecurity. There is also the issue of irregular migrants. Tens of thousands of irregular migrants leave the Horn of Africa, often by way of Yemen, to search for better economic opportunities in Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries. And at a time when Saudi is grappling with its own unemployment issue and trying to reform its economy with Vision 2030, it makes it even more imperative to engage positively with the countries there to amplify economic opportunities. Finally, there is also the major Giga project that Saudi is pursuing throughout the coast of the Red Sea, starting from Neom in the north, going to the Amala, the Red Sea project, which involves 50 Virgin Islands, developing them, and then all the way to Jazan, where there is the Aramco refinery there. So for Saudi, the security is very important also for geo-economic interests and considerations, not only security and political ones.
Okay, great. I mean, that's an excellent overview. Mr. Mutiga, how does it look from the Horn of Africa perspective and also a little further into East Africa? Again, there's obviously a certain strategic and economic interest in engaging more with the Gulf countries. And what does it all look like from the other perspective, from the other side of the equation?
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks for having me. I think one of the striking things when you just look at the broader context of the continent is that if you look across the map of Africa, it's clear that you have a hegemon every which way you look, except for the Horn of Africa that lacks a clear hegemon. So, in Southern Africa, the South African economy is 3 times larger than the next largest one, Angola. The South Africans assert themselves in that region in a very substantial way, and therefore are a very consequential political and economic player. In West Africa, the Nigerian economy accounts for 75% of the whole GDP in the region. So I think, and of course in the north, there's the essential, twin hegemony between Egypt and Algeria. I think one thing that strikes you about the Horn of Africa is that Ethiopia should be an obvious hegemon.
Yes.
In terms of population, in terms of its very strong security state. But it has been reluctant to play that role, partly because it didn't have a great 20th century. I remember Meles Zenawi, after he essentially unilaterally ended the war with Eritrea, drawing a lot of domestic criticism. He said that, listen, Ethiopia's enemy is poverty. It's not Eritrea. And so Ethiopia, for a long time, has sought to just solidify its position, improve its economy, look inward. It has been a status quo power. So I think one of the things that you notice, given the broad interest of external powers in this region, is that there is a bit of a vacuum. That vacuum has been filled in many different ways. You see economic interests, not just by the Gulf powers, but by China as well, which has been discussed quite substantially this morning. We were just discussing with Abdullah at lunch that it's very striking that the typical view is that China is coming in to take resources and leave. But when you look at the numbers, they engage most substantially on the continent with a number of countries that are quite resource poor. Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana. 2 of those are in the Horn of Africa. So there are powers that are making a long-term bet that this region, the population is growing, the economies will only expand, and it's worth making a play there. But you ask how it is viewed. Unfortunately, it's viewed in mixed ways. You know, we of course discussed in the morning that some of the players, these are not helpless partners. These are not players without agency.
Right.
And so there is real capacity among the various political actors especially to use the interest of the Gulf in ways that advantage themselves and sometimes advantage their nations. So for example, in Eritrea, we see that Isaias Afwerki, for him, re-engaging with the Gulf at a time when he was isolated by the international community has yielded very substantial gains.
No doubt.
He's, you know, basically wielding a strong hand in Ethiopia. He's won sanctions relief, and at no cost in terms of the political environment at home. In Somalia, unfortunately, the Gulf is seen as a bit of a ping-pong game where,
we'll talk about that, but no, do go on.
Yes, absolutely. And then, you know, in some countries where you have a little, you know what, maybe it's a bit too strong to call it, but an enlightened self-interest in terms of the state.
Unenlightened?
No, enlightened.
Okay.
So, for example, in Rwanda now, we see that they are taking advantage of the competition, you know, among the various actors coming in. Very recently, we heard that Qatar is taking a position in Rwanda and potentially buying, you know, the airport in terms of taking a role in its construction. And then the UAE is playing an active role in setting up an internal container depot. So there is potentially ways in which actors in the Horn can benefit, but there are also some cynical ways that in which these relations are exploited.
Including by exploiting competition. But we'll come back to that question of cooperation and competition in a little bit. But Ambassador Kelly, I'd like to ask you, I mean, given that the United States has seen the strategic importance of the coast, especially, of the Horn for a long time, and has this enduring military presence in Djibouti, which is unique for the US military, where you served. How does it look from the American point of view? I mean, how do you think the United States wants to interact with this engagement? And if there's anything that's been raised so far that you'd like to comment on as well, please feel free.
Sure, thank you very much. And first of all, let me just say it's a real pleasure to be here with our friends to talk about the Horn of Africa. So first of all, I think the United States kind of moved into the region in a significant way after 9/11, when the Djiboutian authorities kind of provided, offered to the United States the use of Camp Lemonnier, which used to be the foreign base of the French Foreign Legion. And the United States grabbed the opportunity kind of with alacrity because Djibouti offered, you know, a very convenient platform for kind of working in the Horn of Africa, but also having the ability to reach across into the Arabian Peninsula for particularly for counterterrorism missions, but it also is very well placed to deal with kind of the emerging threat of piracy in the region, which threatened kind of fundamental American interests in freedom of navigation. And I hope we'll have the opportunity later on to talk about how we were able to defeat piracy. I think that's kind of one of the unsung triumphs of multilateral cooperation in this century, and maybe is a potential model for multilateral cooperation in the Horn and in other regions later on. I think my fellow speakers here have spoken with great eloquence about what some of the synergies are between the countries in the Horn of Africa and in the GCC. Cultural affinity obviously is kind of an obvious reason for interaction between the two regions. I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular kind of realized the geopolitical significance of this region well before the United States did, if only because, you know, it's your neighborhood, and it is very clear how important and strategic the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden were. But what always struck me in the years that I lived in the Horn of Africa was just the enormous complementarity between the development needs of the nations of the Horn of Africa and what the GCC countries had to offer. Not just in terms of the fact that Africa is kind of in dire need of capital and transportation infrastructure, but also because of the interest in GCC countries, and particularly UAE, in kind of focusing on kind of the next wave of economic development of their own economies, focusing kind of for the post-oil era in making their region kind of a hub of business logistics, focusing on transportation. And the UAE did that kind of in a pioneering way in Djibouti. They were really the first country in any meaningful way to invest resources into Djibouti with the construction of the Durala container terminal. And I think that was, even though UAE is not as active in Djibouti as they were at the beginning of the century, I think it was a precursor for activism that we're seeing UAE have throughout the region, and is a template that's going to be replicable for some time to come.
That's great. By the way, thank both of you for giving us some lovely understatements. I think they're very elegant, and I appreciate it. Ethiopia not having had a great 20th century, and UAE not being quite as active in Djibouti as maybe it once was. This is beautiful. Let's pick up on one of, there are two threads that you've thrown out that I'd like to pick up on. The first is the piracy issue, and then the second, the question of complementarity, which will, but let's explore for a second the question of maritime security, counterterrorism, and especially piracy, which is some kind of a hybrid. Particularly, Dr. Al-Saud, if you can talk a bit about Saudi Arabia's notion of a Red Sea grouping, a Red Sea zone, that would have maritime security as part of its mission. And what is Saudi Arabia trying to construct diplomatically in this zone?
Certainly. If you allow me, I'll give a brief overview of the Saudi engagement with the Horn of Africa region prior to this newly proposed grouping. In early 2018, Saudi designated a specific Minister of State for African Affairs, which shows the importance that it has for Africa in general in its foreign policy. His Excellency Ahmed Gattan, he was previously the ambassador in Egypt. Many have talked in the previous sessions about the historic peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea. That was, of course, in large part due to the political will in both countries. I'm not taking credit here, and other countries, of course, but Saudi Arabia was very instrumental in facilitating and hosting that agreement, along with allies, chief amongst whom is the United Arab Emirates. There is also the pivotal Riyadh agreement. We should not forget Yemen, because it's part of that region. Between the Yemeni legitimate government and the STC, the Southern Transition Council, which saved many lives, and hopefully it will, work as a momentum for a comprehensive political solution in Yemen. Sudan, many feared at the beginning that it would descend into chaos. Thankfully, it turned out better than many expected, thanks to the EU, the AU, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE involvement as well. Saudi has lobbied for the lifting of sanctions on Eritrea. And it's doing the same with Sudan right now.
Yeah.
It is invested in efforts to ease tension between Ethiopia and Egypt. But also on the defense cooperation side, there is, in December, I think 2015, Saudi Arabia announced the establishment of the IMCTC, the International Military Counterterrorism Coalition, which now consists of 41 countries. I think that is often overlooked in terms of the intelligence sharing and the capacity building that it has between GCC countries and countries in the Horn of Africa. I remember in 2016, as one of its first steps, it announced training and capacity building to Somalia at the time. There was also military naval maneuvers that were done in 30 December 2018, I think, on the Red Sea, called Red Wave 1, between Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Egypt, Yemen, Djibouti, and observers from Somalia as well. But then I will move to the most sustained, and I think the one that has the potential to succeed and the highest reward, not only for the countries in the region, but for the international world as a whole, which is the proposed entity of the Arab and African coastal states of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. It was first announced in December 2018 at a ministerial meeting. That was followed by 2 sub-ministerial meetings in Cairo in February and March. And then the 4th meeting was in April in Riyadh. Eritrea joined as well, because initially it was only 7 countries. Now Eritrea has signaled an interest in that. And I think there are so many benefits for this. First of all, traditionally when we talk about the region, we talk about the Horn of Africa separately, North of Africa separately, the Arabian Peninsula, GCC. There seems to be a divide in the region. The Red Sea actually separates Asia from Africa. Yeah. But no one used to look at the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden as the center stage. And this proposed entity fills a vacuum and bridges a gap there. This is one thing that is very important. The other is that it's always useful to have such a platform where countries can coordinate efforts for the collective interest, for maritime security, for other issues, and also not for the sake of those countries only. Let's not forget that insurance rates have risen by a factor of 10 following the recent Iranian attacks on ships. Sure. So if you're not directly affected, you're affected indirectly. Yeah. It's also useful to have such a grouping or a platform whereby resources and relationships can be employed to mitigate conflicts and manage them lest they escalate any further. But it's not just security and politics. There is an economic component as well. That in turn can provide the perfect environment to focus on trade and development. The smaller economies in this grouping can have access to economic opportunities that they would otherwise not have. And they will be able to manage and negotiate better infrastructure and energy deals. Also, this grouping can balance the asymmetrical relationship between the developing economies and other wealthy and stronger and bigger economies within the grouping or even with the outside to manage this flurry of interest in the region. It's still not clear whether this will materialize, but indications are that it will. Hopefully, there was supposed to be an Arab-African summit in November, just last month. It got postponed to early next year. And,
do you know why?
I think there were some logistical issues and difficulties with lots of meetings, especially with Saudi assuming the presidency of the G20 at the same time. But it's, from what I heard, it's going to be early next year, the first quarter of 2020. That will be also preceded by a Saudi African summit, just one day before. One thing that I think Saudi has to assure its partners in this grouping is this is not a grouping to advance any narrow strategic agenda or hegemonic goals. This is win-win for everyone. As His Excellency just said previously, a win-lose relationship is untenable for everyone. And Saudi actually is taking a huge burden in proposing this, but it realizes that this is its immediate neighborhood. It has a vested interest in securing this neighborhood. I forgot also to mention an environmental component to it as well. environment degradation is a serious issue, not only for the region, but for the whole world. Right. And as I said, Saudi is building huge projects along the Red Sea coast, and what happens on the other shore does affect, it's the same body of water, basically. And there is understudied, but recently has been the focus of attention, nexus between climate change and security.
Yeah, sure.
And that is very important to focus on in the coming years.
So, Mr. Mutiga, you've heard in part Dr. Saud's answer included explanation about Saudi Arabia's intentions and as well as its goals, right? Do you think that's going to be widely perceived as a largely sort of enlightened, self-interested, almost altruistic gesture? Or is there going to be some hesitation on the Horn of Africa side of the equation? And what do you think the chances are that Saudi Arabia will be able to construct some meaningful multilateral entity here?
Yeah, no, just to pick up actually on what Dr. Saud said about that Sudan could have been much worse. I think, if you'll allow me just very briefly, I would say that we have focused quite a bit on the precarity of the situation in Sudan and Ethiopia, but it's very critical for us to also just bear in context that this could have gone south. It could have been a bloodbath in Sudan. No doubt. In Ethiopia, at the end of 2017, it was a grinding stalemate. Supplies were running low in Addis Ababa. The youth were very determined. The political elite displayed considerable maturity. They didn't have to step down. If they had continued, the danger is that you could have begun to stress critical institutions, yes, like the military, which is what we've seen in such, protracted confrontations.
When they become disastrous, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So Ethiopia could easily have been far worse. The elite displayed maturity by stepping back. As Susan said earlier, Sudan, the sustained peaceful nature of that protest movement gives us cause for hope. I remember just one quick anecdote. We were interviewing at Crisis Group for a Sudan analyst not very long ago, just at the end of 2018. Every candidate, we asked them, what do you think Bashir's future is? How secure is he in his position? Everybody thought he's very secure in his position. He'll defy the party. He'll run again in 2020. It's hard to see how to stop him, so he'll remain in power. I just remember one Lebanese candidate with wonderful, Lebanese humor just said that he seems okay, but he's doing well enough for a man falling off a building. At least, she sensed that the economy was in such dire state that he could not long survive. But it's important for us to appreciate this is really momentous change. So just to come back to the Red Sea Forum.
That is a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So now just on the Red Sea Forum, for sure, I don't think you'll find too many objectors in the Horn. As Abdul hinted and as the minister just spoke about, there's a very strong tradition of multilateralism on the continent. This is a place where solidarity was very critical, particularly at independence. It's a continent with 16 landlocked countries, which is the highest by far in the world. It's probably not a coincidence that 6 out of the 10 poorest countries in the world are in Africa and are landlocked. So this is a place where any initiative that encourages multilateralism, that encourages working together across borders will be welcome. I would just caution against assuming that despite this tradition of multilateralism, everybody shares an interest. I remember one veteran Ethiopian diplomat speaking to Djiboutians who were very spooked after the Ethiopia-Eritrea peace deal. And they thought, we've taken these massive loans. We are expanding the port. We've built the railway, 88% debt to GDP ratio. What will we do if Ethiopia turns to Eritrea? And that man happens to be in the room. It's actually Abdul that told them, listen, don't panic. You are a commercial elite. The Eritreans are a security-focused elite. You are unlikely to lose the business, because you are more focused on commerce. So I think it's important to recognize that there are diverse interests, that all the leaders have their own game. Not all of them are very keen on regional integration. Some of them just want survival. So it's good to approach it with just the sense that these are people, obviously, with diverse interests, but there is, for sure, a tradition of multilateralism. Perhaps, as Dr. Saud said, you could build incrementally. Focus, for example, initially on security, which everybody agrees on. IGAD began as an organization to combat desertification. So you can begin small and then build up.
Yeah. Ambassador Kelly, I'll take you up on your invitation to tell us about the anti-piracy campaign that was very successful. What lessons could you draw from that could be applicable to this initiative or other important endeavors?
I think a lot of times when we talk about kind of global developments and international security, we tend to focus on challenges and bad news. When we find a good news story, we don't always pay proper attention to it. And I think that the struggle against counter-piracy is worth talking about a little bit. First of all, because as I said, I think it's probably the biggest success story, multilateral success story anywhere in the world in this young century. But secondly, it's a success story that happened in this region and involved a lot of the governments that and countries that are represented here today. I mean, when the piracy problem really started to manifest itself, 2007, 8, 9, it really constituted both a threat to freedom of navigation in one of the most strategic bodies of water in the world, one of the most heavily transited bodies of water in the world. It was a threat to almost every significant economy in the world. It was a threat to the lives of mariners. Hundreds of mariners were taken hostage and killed by pirates, and it was, frankly, a threat to the global economy too, because it really affected transit of energy resources, and kind of just it was affecting maritime insurance rates. So it was a big threat. What I think was so striking about the response was that for once governments kind of resisted the impulse to just focus on solution just by leaning entirely on the military or entirely on kind of government to government diplomatic negotiations. But instead it was really kind of first of all, it was remarkably broad-based. It involved, I think, more than 80 nations, very diverse, a number of countries from the European Union, GCC countries, both Saudi Arabia and UAE played very, very important roles. Several African nations, including Djibouti, played a very important role. India, China, Russia. So the military part of the response was arguably the broadest naval coalition that's ever been assembled in history, albeit an informal coalition. But that was extraordinary, and I think it reflects the fact that freedom of navigation is such a widely valued asset for governments. So clearly having the world's navies mobilize to protect shipping in strategically vital shipping lanes was very important, but just having a military response wasn't enough. We needed to mobilize governments in all of the aspects of their power to kind of coordinate a response. And so the contact group on combating piracy off the coast of Africa convened under the auspices of the United Nations, but was separate from the United Nations, and met with a fairly robust op-tempo, meeting all over the world to discuss the problem and develop responses. But then the third aspect that I think was critical in resolving the problem was it involved the private sector as well. So that you got the shipping companies involved, because clearly there was a lot of things that you could do to protect shipping if the shipping lines themselves took steps, even very simple steps like putting barbed wire around the perimeter of ships to make it harder for pirates to clamber up the top. And the coordination of the military, the diplomatic, and the private sector responses to this, coupled with the urgency of the issue and the fact that you had so many different governments from such a broad range of areas was collaborating, resulted in a response that really almost annihilated piracy in a matter of a few years. Now, piracy is never going to go away forever. It's one of the world's oldest professions. Yeah. But at the same time, I think the efficacy of the response has been very impressive. And so what that says to me in terms of the issues we're talking about today is, given all of the urgency of the needs in the region, multilateral responses are going to have to be a key aspect of the response. And the fact that you have so many countries from outside the Horn of Africa, near neighbors like the GCC countries, but also countries in Asia, Europe, and even North America, is a reflection of the fact that multilateral responses are still valid in this region. The fact that we have so many governments from different traditions that are involved here isn't necessarily a bad thing. In a way, it kind of speaks to the potential and the strategic importance of the Horn of Africa.
Great. Let's shift gears a little bit for a second. We've mainly been talking about good news, in effect. But I'd like to look at some of the more controversial aspects of the GCC's or GCC countries' engagement in parts of the Horn of Africa. I mean, there are countries, maybe the most obvious example is Somalia, where there's been a degree of competition between, for example, the UAE and Qatar, and in other instances as well, which has somehow interacted with local tensions, for example, between the government in Mogadishu and local autonomous authorities in Puntland and Somaliland and what have you. So there is this, an aspect to this engagement, of course, which reflects certain tensions in the region, in both regions, and then they kind of start to interact because the actors are interacting. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, thanks. For sure, I mean, it's a big issue. We see that actually external intervention in parts of the Horn can be both a curse and a blessing. If you look at the way countries in crisis have pulled themselves from, years of civil war. If you look at Uganda in the mid-80s, if you look at Rwanda in the mid-90s, where it was local action and local forces and local elites that took it upon themselves, fought their way through resolving that crisis. You may not like the type of administration that comes after that crisis, but there has been an enduring resolution to the civil war, where there has been substantial external intervention, even when well-meaning. And in this, I have in mind Somalia, but also the DRC, which is not in the Horn, but is in the near neighborhood. and now we see it, in other places, including South Sudan, where you have this substantial external efforts to resolve the crisis. Unfortunately, even when we are well-meaning, it has resulted in protracted crisis. Unfortunately, Somalia is the poster boy for that. We see a place with weak institutions, and then engagement that doesn't engage institutions, but engages individuals and picks favorites, and that is causing problems. And we worry now acutely about the 2020 election and 2021. I think it's very important that outside powers that can have a role in building stability make sure that the next election is not a bidding war, particularly between the UAE and Qatar. I think that will really atrophy institutions. It will not be constructive. And I think more broadly, just building on the point Alex made, I think it's time that the Somali leaders and their elites were encouraged to look for their own organic internal resolution to the protracted crisis, which will inevitably have to involve talks, not just between the government in Mogadishu and the federal member states, but also with Al-Shabaab, which has become such essentially a movement, not just that commits terrible atrocities, but also which has clear political goals.
Yeah, no doubt. Dr. Al-Saud, what do you think of this set of issues?
I think it's very important for the countries of the Horn of Africa not to get drawn into power struggles, either regionally or globally. Because what I worry also is that global power competition, these countries, not only in the Horn of Africa, but also even Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region, can be subjected to this global power competition, which can be very, very dangerous, especially as we have established already in the previous sessions, at an era when the whole international system is in flux and changing, and we still don't know, are we moving to a multipolar system? What kind of system are we moving into? So it's very important to, and this actually highlights the importance of multilateral mechanisms that can be put in place in order to coordinate efforts and positions in how to deal with this with this flurry of activity. Traditionally speaking about China, Chinese engagement with the Horn of Africa has been economic in character. One of the biggest countries that China invested in initially was Sudan, when it was facing economic sanctions, and it used to import 5 to 7% of its energy needs from Sudan at one point, and 5% from Yemen. Now the percentage from both countries goes to, in 2018, 0.7% and 0.2%. That has to do with internal political instability, but also with the intentional drive from China to diversify its energy intake from countries away from unstable countries. But expectedly so, I would think that China is increasing its military footprint in the region in order to protect its growing economic interests, which is logical. The flag follows the trade, not vice versa. And it's very important that the question for us in the region, for Saudi, for Yemen, for the countries on the other shore, is how to deal with that. Should we form, because I'm always saying that regional grown solutions are the answer to many of our problems. And we should invest in them, in multilateral institutions, regardless how flawed are they, but they are the only means that we have to coordinate efforts. And I think, if you look at the GCC, it's a successful example, despite the challenges that has been happening. You see many of the aspects are still ongoing, and it would have been much worse if such a grouping was not there. So why not replicate or do something similar on that very strategic area that, as I explained, there is a gap, there is a vacuum. There is no entity that combines the countries on the east and the west of this very important strategic waterway.
And that's the same point Mr. Mutiga was making about the lack of a regional hegemon as well.
Yeah.
So, Ambassador Kelly, the United States in its history has been on both sides of this equation, right? In its early phase of its history, it was subject to a lot of it was buffeted by English-French competition, lots of meddling, efforts to push European powers back into their own hemisphere, and then subsequently, in the 20th century in particular, global rivalries with other powers, particularly the Soviet Union, and of constant accusations of meddling and bidding wars and whatnot. So based on that history and the American experience, what sort of advice would you give both sides of this equation here, the Horn of Africa side and the Gulf side, as they seek to navigate this? It's kind of difficult, I think.
Yeah, so for the Horn of Africa, I guess my advice or observation is, there are going to be a lot of international participants that are interested in your development and in your resources and what you have to offer. And so you should take advantage of the fact that you have many suitors and play that to your advantage as much as possible. My own experience dealing with the Djiboutian government is that they were extraordinarily agile in playing all these different countries that were interested in their geographic location off of each other. I sometimes wished as the U.S. ambassador that they were less agile, but they did an excellent job. And I think that most of the governments in the region are very sophisticated in understanding and not wanting to be a client state of any particular country, but wanting to leverage what all of these countries have to offer for their development and other needs. With respect to the Gulf countries, I think my advice, if I can call it that, would just be to realize that even though you might regard this region kind of as your near neighborhood or your back door, the fact that there's other international participants looking at the region with interest and participating in it doesn't mean that you're going to be pushed aside. I think that the GCC countries, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, are better placed than any other kind of external country in the Horn of Africa to be extremely important force for good in the region for a very long time to come.
Great. We haven't mentioned the word Turkey at all during this conversation, but Turkey is sort of another actor. It's another player in this region, not a global power like China or the United States, it's a regional power in the sense that it's there in the northern part of the Middle East, but it doesn't have the same kind of geographic relationship with the Red Sea that Saudi Arabia or even the UAE does. So what about the Turkish role? It's often overlooked, but it's very significant, isn't it? I can begin with you, Dr.
No, you're right. I think Turkey has already a $50 million military base in Somalia, and has already talked with the authorities in Sudan of port rehabilitation at Sawakin. But the fate of that is unknown with the political transition there. As you said, Turkey is a regional power, but I think right now it has bigger problems to deal with closer to its neighborhood than focusing. But it's very important to this is when the GCC wants to engage with the Horn of Africa, especially Saudi Arabia, since this is its immediate neighborhood, not to the exclusion of our other countries, because this very important strategic waterway, many countries are stakeholders in its safety, but to manage it in a way that does not threaten the security or the immediate interest, collective interest, not just individual interest.
Thoughts on the Turkish role from either of you? I mean,
yeah, well, I was struck in my time in Djibouti by how active the Turks were in the region. And my Turkish colleagues explained to me that they have kind of long-standing historic ties there. The Ottoman Empire used to extend all the way down to northern Djibouti, and some of the mosques in the Afar region of Djibouti were built by the Ottomans. You know, Turkey sees. You know, Turkey is also kind of trying to transform its economy, focusing on transportation and logistics. Turkish Airlines is one of the most active airlines in Africa now. And you know, there's Turkish business interests all through the region. So I expect that they're going to continue to be one of the many players that are interested in the Horn of Africa.
Well, what about the long game Turkey's playing in the region, developing partnerships often through business connections more than anything else, and creating sticky power, right? that kind of phrase.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, Turkey, I think it's no coincidence that their biggest embassy in the world is in Mogadishu. They definitely are playing a long game, but the way the Turks perceive themselves is that they're not part of the GCC dispute. And they see themselves as playing a different game and often resent the fact that organizations like ours put them squarely within the GCC dispute.
You mean the crisis group?
Yes. Okay. So, for example, in our reporting, they are very keen to emphasize they are not part of that dispute. They're a different kind of power. They're a market economy, quite different oriented in their approach. They say that in their engagement in places like Ethiopia, in places like Somalia, they're trying to build a trading relationship. And so, especially through the Gulen network, a couple of years ago, before obviously recent events, they were very effective in sending at retail level business people into villages, remote villages, offering them financial support and also a network that they could call upon, and then helping them to embed themselves within society in places that you would not expect. So the Turkish game, they clearly are playing a long game. Of course, as Dr. Saud said, things have changed a little. The economic fortunes are probably not what they would want them to be. And so we see a bit of a retrenchment. The whole crisis with the Gulen network did not help. But what strikes me is that the Turks have been quite successful in building soft power. So, for example, you'll find young girls in Mogadishu called Istanbul. So that is interesting and a bit different. I remember a senior Somalia government official saying actually that decoupling with the Turks could bring people into the streets, which is not commonly appreciated out there. So we don't know what the truth is, but the Turkish game is long-term, complex, but not yet fully understood. But can I just add that perhaps Saudi Arabia potentially could play a role in Somalia. The way the GCC dispute is viewed in Somalia is seen primarily through the prism of Doha and Abu Dhabi. And Saudi influence, given the Islamic role that Saudi Arabia plays, they could potentially mediate a dialing down of tensions. I know there could be already some back channel talks, but potentially there's a role that Saudi Arabia can play, especially going into the election, to dial down tensions.
That segues perfectly into the first question that I've got on this app, and I'd invite all of you to start lobbing questions for our panel through me here. So please do that. But the first question I got was, how does Saudi Arabia's recent promotion of more moderate and tolerant forms of Islam affect its policies towards the Horn? And that really goes exactly to what you were getting at as a potential role for Riyadh as a brokering power, which maybe other Gulf countries are less well positioned to do, and for various reasons. Can you talk about that a little?
No, I think this new drive internally, these new reforms, economic and social reforms that since 2015 or 2016 actually with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, they are very positive, but I wouldn't think that they have anything to do with the foreign policy, because historically speaking, Saudi did not engage in its relations, in its foreign policy based on religious factors. It's always has been political
reasons of state.
Exactly, pragmatic political interest.
Sure.
And this is one of the things, when analysts look at the region and the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran, some people look at it through the prism of sectarianism, which is completely wrong. They assume one country is Sunni, the other country is Shia. That is why they are fighting. Some would look at it through the prism of the political system, absolute monarchy and
republic.
Although the supreme leader is the ultimate decision maker. But that's also completely wrong. And I think, it comes down to the competing visions or models for the region. One that is centered around strong nation states that have complete governance and control all over its territory, regardless of the political system they're in, and the other that thrives in weak and fragile states in which non-state actors can be empowered to play the role of the state in order to increase the influence. And that's, if you look at developments in the region through this prism, many things would make sense.
Ambassador Kelly, is this a global phenomenon in a way of regional actors of medium-sized powers stepping in where there is a vacuum because the global system is in transition, because the United States and the Soviet Union, or then just the United States, is less and less sort of globally assertive. And there's potentially a need for regional actors to assume more of a leadership role. Is that what we're seeing in the Horn? And if so, is it a part of a broader international trend?
Yeah, I think that this is certainly an era where all over the world we're seeing kind of mid-level powers kind of manifesting themselves more aggressively in regional theaters. And I don't think that's necessarily, from an American perspective, a bad thing. I think after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were in an era for 10 or 15 years in which there was basically one superpower, and some people in my country assumed that was just the so-called end of history, and that was going to be it. But if you look at history, over the centuries, that's never been the case. There's always going to be emerging powers, and there's always going to be kind of shifting influence throughout the world. And so I think that what we've seen in the last 10 years is kind of a restoration of equilibrium as new powers rise. Not just China, but also countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And also kind of regional powers in Africa, like South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia. All of these countries have a little more room for maneuver now, and the more agile of them are going to take advantage of that. And we're seeing that in South Asia and East Asia as well.
I think a lot of the public in the United States welcomes that. I don't know about other sort of centers of influence, but it seems to be quite popular with big chunks of the public. Yes?
Yeah, no, just going to pick up on what Ambassador Kelly said earlier about potential, taking advantage of the number of suitors and benefiting from that. And the great example of the 20th century obviously was China. And it's not really well studied enough in the region, but the way in which Deng Xiaoping and his team took advantage of competition between the Soviets and the Americans was really a masterclass of geopolitical management. You know, his famous dictum, bide your time, hide your strengths. They worked with the Americans essentially to rise as a global power, and there's a lesson there for a lot of elites, not just in the Horn, but across Africa in a period of geopolitical power competition, that you can leverage that competition, not just among, you know, Beijing and DC, but also, you know, between the various medium-sized powers to take advantage.
Great. We've got an audience member who wonders if the concentration, Gulf concentration on the Horn comes at the expense of some other areas that are very, very important, and specifically mentioned the Sahel, which can be, you know, is sort of emerging hotbed of lawlessness and crime and terrorism and extremism and banditry and whatnot. I'm not sure I completely understand the logic of this question, but I'm throwing it out there anyway because it's an interesting question.
I don't think it should come at the expense of that region or any other region. But for Saudi, as I said, this is the immediate neighborhood. Of course, it would be a priority. But tackling, you know, terrorism and armed non-state actors and terrorist groups, wherever they are found, is a priority because they know and respect no boundaries. You know, the threat travels, ideas travels, and inspirations. You know, we suffer from the so-called lone wolves attacks, although that is, you know, I'm against this phrase, and I don't think, you know, it rarely happens that someone is inspired alone without any contact with other groups through the internet. But still, you know, ideas travel, and this is a threat, a real threat that faces international peace and security. And, you know, focus should be, as we diversify our economy, we should also diversify our relationships, East and West and everywhere.
And presumably the kind of multilateral effort that we've been talking about regarding piracy, now maybe regarding the Red Sea as a zone, could eventually be applied in the Sahel region.
Certainly, certainly, absolutely. I mean, if we talk about this entity, this Red Sea entity, there are so many questions still unresolved. I think in terms of design, in terms of membership, there are lots of you know, sensitive issues that has to be resolved through concentrated diplomacy and bilateral diplomacy from the part of, you know, the Saudi Arabia and the other big countries in the region. You know, I think of Ethiopia, a landlocked country, but very important. You know, 100 million people. It's the second largest economy in the continent. It has a vested interest, as we said, in the stability of this region. The UAE is one of the most active players in the Horn of Africa. So are they going to be members? Are they not? Are you including them as states, or maybe including other regional groupings such as the GCC, AU, as observers? As you know, there are so many unresolved questions that have to be discussed also between members.
Yeah, and then I want to ask you a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just very briefly, I think that question also reflects something that people in the Horn need to bear in mind. I remember hearing a diplomat telling Somali elites that, listen, people are tired of this conflict. There's predictable weariness. It's been going on for a long time. We are not sure when it'll end. And the Sahel is sucking a lot of oxygen from the room. There's a lot of attention being paid to the Sahel, partly because it's quite shocking, the very sudden descent of places like Mali that around 2006 were actually labeled as very sparkling success stories. So I think it's something to bear in mind in the Horn, that a lot of attention is shifting to the Sahel, and especially with the crisis in Libya, that will continue.
No doubt, yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about other potential disputes and long-running sort of confrontations or struggles that exist in the Horn that the GCC countries could play a positive role, especially Saudi Arabia. You mentioned that it was potentially positioned to play a brokering role, for example, in Somalia. Are there other regional disputes in the Horn that Gulf engagement could positively benefit, building on this extraordinary example of the Ethiopian-Eritrean peace treaty? a remarkable agreement.
Yeah, I think that's a critical one. I would say that perhaps the most important geopolitical confrontation revolves around the Nile resources and how to share those resources. Yeah. We discussed it a little in the morning, but I would say that given the shared interest among Gulf powers, not just in Egypt, but also increasingly in Ethiopia and also in Sudan, we are often told that Port Sudan is about 400 kilometers from Riyadh. Yeah. And so there is obvious capacity for improved integration economically, and I think helping to dial down tensions, helping Addis and Cairo to view the Grand Renaissance Dam as a mutually beneficial project. I think that would be very, very important, not just to draw a pact between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, but also to encourage a more multilateral framework for managing riverine resources. Yeah. This is the longest river in the world, and it's one of the few cross-country riverine resources with no management framework.
Yeah. Ambassador Kelly, let's talk for a second about the Renaissance Dam. In terms of its ability to create tensions, which obviously is considerable, but also the prospects for making it is some kind of win-win scenario, or at least tolerable to all players, even if they don't think they're winning. At least they could, not believe they're losing tremendously. Can you talk a bit about how that could be managed, and whether there is a role for Gulf countries or the United States or any other powers?
Well, what's clear is it's a great opportunity for diplomats to try to head off potential interstate conflict and develop win-win solutions. So yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for countries in the GCC, if they're so inclined, to try to, because they're considered, I think, that they have good relationships with both the countries in the Horn of Africa as well as Egypt. I think they would be the most obvious kind of arbiters to work out some kind of a win-win solution that all the parties to the conflict can subscribe to.
You would think so,
if I may,
you certainly may.
I think it would be, Saudi definitely is playing tries to play a constructive role in easing tensions, but it would be very difficult to be perceived as impartial player, because ultimately, Egypt is in the Arab League, and Saudi, even though would like to see this issue resolved, I don't think it will be perceived as an impartial player. I think on the 13th of January next year, there is a meeting in Washington between the three countries, and hopefully we can see a breakthrough there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure impartiality is essential to effective brokerage, but I take your point. I mean, it's an obstacle to doing. I mean, something you have to overcome. But I think we've seen effective brokering by extremely partial actors, and it has actually worked. But it's a question for everybody that sort of logically builds off of this. Are there any concrete areas for U.S.-China cooperation in a manner that would reinforce constructive Gulf Horn ties, which we've been talking about this entire panel? I mean, what kind of interaction the U.S. and China could have in terms of promoting that together? We'll begin with you, Dr. Al-Saud.
Well, I think we would love to see cooperation rather than competition between the U.S. and China, especially following, in 2017 when China built its first ever naval base in Djibouti. I don't know, Ambassador, if you were there at the time or not.
Yes, unfortunately I was.
So that raised alarm and concern in the Congress. If I remember correctly, John Bolton at the time...
You remember correctly.
Highlighted the Trump African strategy and the need to combat rivals like China and Russia. So that kind of escalation and global competition in this region is harmful to Saudi and to the Horn of African countries. So what we love and like to see is more competition. And I think there are areas not only in the Horn of Africa, that could be of tension for countries like Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries, especially when we talk about the technology, which could be a fault line area, you know, the G5 and other issues with the trade war now between the US and China. So that's something that we all have to deal with.
Yeah.
And it's up to the US and Chinese to figure out how to...
So even something as basic as that bilateral trade tension has an impact on everything, including Gulf ties to the Horn and everything. Yeah, that's I mean, I think that's an excellent point. Ambassador Kelly, same questions for you, basically. I mean, can you... And I'm
sure.
The same
I mean, I think it's clear that, you know, all the world wants to see cooperation between the U.S. and China, and the areas in which U.S. and China can collaborate are kind of almost infinite across the board on global issues. Certainly, there's a lot of areas in which our two countries can and should be collaborating. And then even within the Horn of Africa, there's kind of some obvious areas. And counter-piracy was an area in which we, in fact, did collaborate. You know, I'm very interested in this issue because I was one of the people in the U.S. government who tried to work out areas in which the U.S. and China could indeed cooperate. And some of the areas were in Africa. We thought that given increasing Chinese participation in peacekeeping in the region, the fact that we both kind of share an interest in tamping down regional conflicts in places like Sudan, but also in areas like demining in areas that of Africa that had been subject to conflict in the past. I traveled to Beijing with a very senior U.S. delegation in the last administration to try to convince the Chinese to do this, and unfortunately we didn't get anywhere. So I think what I would say to people from many other countries who are interested in this and don't understand why there isn't more collaboration is, you know, frankly, it takes two to tango. Yeah. That doesn't mean that the current administration shouldn't give up and keep trying. I think that's very important. And I know in Djibouti now, military commanders in both the United States and China are, you know, have a dialogue to try to avoid conflict, and I think that's very good. But I think clearly a lot more could be done.
No doubt. And yeah, go ahead, but then I also want to come to...
If I might just add something on this issue, just to highlight, you know, China always presents itself as coming for economic reasons that has nothing to do with, it's not value-laden, and one of its main pillars is non-interference in the affairs of states and everything. But when we talk to them, and I've been to Beijing, you know, many times in conferences, and I say, well, if this is one of your pillars, then Iran, one of your allies, is basically, you know, basing its foreign policy on interference and supporting of armed groups. So why don't you interfere and play a constructive role there, since you have good relationship with Saudi, you have good relationship with, and immediately they would not accept that. They would say, well, the United States is wrong because it withdrew from the JCPOA. So the wider competition, the power competition takes precedence, even if it goes against the immediate interests, their immediate interests in the region. So just to highlight, you know, the negative impact of this competition and the inability to look at issues in the region for what they are. Instead, there's always this competition that is at the first.
I mean, well, both of you are kind of suggesting that China needs to mature a little bit as a global power before this becomes easier to do. That's basically what I hear both of you saying. I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you the same question. Areas of U.S.-Chinese cooperation that could help the constructive relations between the Gulf and the Horn.
Yeah, no, just picking up from that, I would say that the way it's perceived from the Horn is that the great power competition is at a phase where cooperation is unlikely, especially in the short run. We see that with the new American policy, there's just open competition in places like Kenya, for example. Rumors of information wars against each other, very active attempts to undermine each other within the country. In Ethiopia, a real battle to shape the future of a country where China was once very prominent, still is economically, but politically perhaps has lost out. In Sudan, potentially, you could have seen Chinese and American cooperation on reviving the economy. The Chinese own about a fifth of Sudan's $60 billion debt. Yeah. But there was absolutely no cooperation at the UN. The Chinese, resisted even the mildest critical statements at the Security Council in a certain phase of the crisis. So we don't see too many prospects for cooperation. It would be interesting what the European Union has been exploring potential for ways in which they can collaborate. It would be interesting to know what has come of that. But I think it's probably too optimistic to expect cooperation at this stage, even though the case for cooperation is very clear. Africa doesn't trade within itself, for example. The case for just putting in financial support to improve connections, regional integration, only 12% of trade within Africa is carried out by Africans themselves, where in the EU it's 63%. So there is an underserved market that requires potentially pooled support, but we don't see that happening.
Yeah. Let me follow up with you with a very broad question that really is for all of you, but I'll begin with you. What will the Horn look like in 20 years? Conflicts, economies and poverty, regional alignments and global positioning. So you're all going to be Nostradamus for a minute and tell us, look into the future and describe it. Good luck.
Yeah, we'll need it. But, the thing is, funnily enough, I just came from a conference in Kigali organized by the Nation Media Group, which is a Kenyan company, one of the largest media organizations on the continent.
Yeah,
they turned 60 this year, and the theme of that conference was how Africa will look in 60 years' time. And I found it very interesting. I would say that there are warning signs, but there are also many reasons to be optimistic. If you look at where the continent has come from in recent years, you had all these authoritarian leaders that were completely unaccountable to the people and seemed very secure in their position, that didn't bother about managing the economies in ways that spread the wealth better. You have now a very restless young population that demands more. This can be both a risk, but it can be productively deployed. It means that a continent where the median age is 19, but the average age of the leaders is 62, something has to give. The leadership has to change towards a more accountable direction. But if that doesn't happen, then there'll be trouble. So I think it's a good thing broadly that you have a more well-educated, healthy, young, ambitious population that is very well connected and knows what it wants. I think something will have to give in the leadership, and potentially that gives us hope, even if there might be pain in the short run.
Excellent. I'd like to go right around the panel with this very broad question. Ambassador Kelly?
Well, I think there could be a variety of outcomes. I prefer to be optimistic for some of the reasons that my fellow speaker just mentioned. I think the fact that you have very young population, that you have kind of a palpable desire among this population for more representative government, or just good governance in general. And then another factor that I think is very important is the diffusion of technology broadly in the population through things like the mobile phone. that kind of empower individuals to learn about the world and kind of circumvents kind of more traditional systems of control over these populations in a way that could unlock the potential of the region, I think, is very promising. And the fact that, as we've talked about all day, the fact that there's so much international interest in the region potentially is another key that could unlock the development potential of the region.
Great.
Just very briefly, I think lots will hinge on how the political transition in the region's two largest countries, Ethiopia and Sudan, will go on. So if we manage to support those two countries, they will provide a good example for the whole region, because they can either negatively or positively influence other countries in the region. And also another important point is because there is a young demographic in many of those young countries, is to look at the youth as an opportunity, not a burden, and that's very important. Educate them, train them, and empower them. And as the ambassador, I'm an optimist, and I prefer to look at the glass half full. And I think in 20 years we will see this entity already established and successful, hopefully.
Oh, great. We did have a question that's a lot narrower than the last one. But there may not be much to talk about based on it. I don't know, actually. The audience member wants to know what role Iran plays in the Horn.
Has played or will play?
No, has been playing.
Has a very negative role.
No, I mean, but what is it?
It's been supporting and arming and training the Houthi rebels.
Yeah.
There has been reports that a cargo ship has been stationed off Yemen for intelligence purposes. It has been trying to use the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden as a waterway to transport arms to its various proxies and militias, and through their proxies establish a foothold in the region. This is the view from Saudi, and I have to stress this is my own personal view. I don't represent the government in any way.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, we know that, yeah. What do you think about Iran's role, less on the periphery of the Horn, but actually in the Horn, if it is engaged with any of the governments or any sub-national groups or anything like that? I'm not really familiar with a lot of Iranian activity.
Yeah, I was hoping not to have to answer that.
Well,
no, that's fine.
If you're not sure about it, that means there isn't that much, probably.
It's not very prominent. It's not a very substantial role. In fact, you'll find that culturally, Iran is more active in West Africa, where there's a bit of a bigger Shiite population, but also a Lebanese business community that's very prominent and that Iran feels very engaged with. In the Horn, of course, there have been cultural centers, but the way we see Iran engaging is more in terms of preparing, seemingly, from where we sit, for future confrontation with its own rivals within its near neighborhood and with places like Israel. So we see that a lot of Israeli and Iranian counter moves in places including Kenya, but it's not a very substantial role, although it's interesting whether Yemen is perceived as a part of the Horn. The Horn is a very nebulous concept. It's not very well defined, but it's interesting that you raise the Yemen because there are Somali people that near Aden that, for example, take a boat and go to hospital in Yemen and then come back to Somalia. Just to illustrate that the cultural and social ties often defy those boundaries. I wouldn't say Iran is a particularly active player within the classic Horn, but it is present, has been present, especially in Sudan and Eritrea, and seems to be playing a long game in terms of its own geopolitical games.
All right, final question for each of you. Again, I'm going to ask you to prognosticate, but not about such a big thing over such a long time. But just what's the general trajectory of Gulf Horn relations in the next 5 years? Where, well, I mean, it has been greatly increasing over the past 5 years in particular, but over the past 15 more broadly. Is it going to continue to intensify, and what's it going to look like? And we'll just go around the group beginning with
Certainly.
you.
I think Saudi, from the point of view of Saudi Arabia, I think it would like to increase its engagement, positive engagement with the countries of the Horn of Africa. It would like to expand on its role as a diplomatic broker in the region to ease tensions between the countries for the collective good and benefit, to amplify economic opportunities for all involved. And as I said, this is because Saudi perceives this region as very important geostrategically to its own interest and safety. So I see the next 5 years as even more engagement, trying to reach out to the countries of the Horn and even far beyond.
And the Red Sea initiative.
And the Red Sea initiatives. I suspect 2020 we will see an announcement about it. If not in the upcoming Arab-African summit, then maybe shortly after. Yeah. This is my own analysis. Yeah.
Great. Ambassador Khan.
Well, I see the GCC countries as more ambitious and self-confident than ever, and I think that bodes well for this region. I think that we're going to continue to see GCC countries being very active in the Horn of Africa and in lots of other regions that are important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to add to what Dr. Saud said, in terms of we see increased engagement, but these transitions need very urgent support. I think the question is, how everybody defines success, and especially in places like Sudan, what stability means. I think there's a divergence of opinion in different parts.
Can you describe that a little bit? Give us a sense of what the differing views are.
Yeah, so for example, during the protest movement, and the minister referred to it earlier, there was a perception that the view from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi is that stability means a strong man. Perhaps a strong man who is friendly to us. We've seen an evolution, that's probably too strong. I sense from the minister's speech today an encouraging endorsement of multilateralism, an endorsement of the African Union role, a strong commitment to improvements in Sudan and a durable transition. I would say that's encouraging. What I was referring to was, for example, during the protests, you would see young people painting on the walls, Madania or Egypt, revolution or counter-revolution. Yeah. So we see that there's more convergence now between much of Sudanese society, but also Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. I would say that the Sudanese transition is extremely fragile. Unfortunately, when you have a strong man in charge for a long time, people focus, for example, on how Bashir weakened the military, created all this militia so that only he could govern the country effectively. But even the economy is now essentially structured to fail. Fuel is 10 cents a liter, 10 cents dollars. It's basically free.
Yeah.
I remember just being in a hotel where lunch was 500 Sudanese pounds, and then my taxi driver friend filled up his tank with 300 Sudanese pounds. The exchange rate has basically collapsed. You can get in the bank, they'll give you £1.47. In the streets, you get double that. Export cover is very low. Sudan obviously needs very urgent support. A lot of it probably will come from the Gulf, but there's also a need to just keep everybody in the room, understand what the long-run goal is, and I would say that transition will really test how these relations potentially can be a model or not.
Excellent. Do you want to
just very quickly follow up on what my colleague
Absolutely.
said? I think this just highlights the importance of communication and building trust, because for successful engagements and the building of multilateral institution, two things: trust and mutual interest. Those two things are important. And just from the point of view of Saudi, it doesn't really matter much what kind of political system there is in the country. What matters is that country does not descend into chaos. There has to be a strong central government there. And just a few examples, when the Muslim Brotherhood government in 2013 took charge and was elected in Egypt, Saudi promised immediately an economic package of aid to that country. When the Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, the Popular Mobilization Force, the government decided to include it within the military, Saudi supported that, even though that could have strengthened, some increased the Iranian influence within the Iraqi government. But it's always better to deal and interact with a strong government, a central government, rather than attacks come at you from within their border, and then the government says, well, I don't know who did that. It's not me. Talk to the other militia.
People with no name and no address.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's just to clarify the intention from this side of the region.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Please join me in really thanking our panel. Excellent.